May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be to the greater honor and glory of God. Amen. I would love to be able to stand up here and say that COVID is over and we never have to deal with COVID again and such a terrible disease. But I found out this week that one of our members has just been diagnosed with COVID. But today we're going to talk about another disease, a disease that has been with mankind for ever since we began to think and to feel. And this disease is called if-only disease. And the side effects are remorse and regret and even anger. If-only disease is the idea that some catastrophe could have been prevented, that maybe a singular act of prevention would change the outcome. One of my earliest memories is of my father going to the VA hospital, being in the hospital, and of course I was too young to go visit him. But I was told by my parents that he had contracted pneumonia. This eventually, because he had smoked most of his life, led to emphysema, and because we ate rather unhealthily, I jokingly say that during my lifetime I saw us go from the lard bucket to Crisco, to then corn oil, and now we're in the kind of the olive oil stage, which supposedly is more heart healthy. But I remember that it became this thing as I was growing up that my dad would get sick, he would go to the hospital, he would get fixed up, and then he would come out of the hospital again. The last time, and so we got used to this cycle, knowing that one day he was going to go into the hospital and not come out. My last visit with my father was in mid-April of 1986. And he had just been out fishing, told me he had had his best bucket of minnows that he'd ever fished with in his life. And he had just caught this huge smallmouth bass. And at that time I was doing taxidermy, and he said, do you want to taxidermy this fish? And I said, no, if fishing is as good as you think it is, you may catch one, twice that size or bigger. But he was dealing with a chronic cold. And I said, you really need to go to the doctor and get that checked on. A few days later, he came stumbling to the back door and collapsed. And my brother happened to be there, and he called for an ambulance. And he was taken to the hospital, and then that night, unbeknownst to us at the time, but later in the morning, we received a call that he had died, that little chronic cold had become septicemia. And for the longest time, for months, and that I had the if-only disease, that if only I had badgered him more, if only he had gone to the doctor earlier, he would have lived longer. If only he had not smoked and started smoking when he was 12 years old and smoked for decades. If only he had eaten a healthier lifestyle. My grandmother, my beloved grandmother, she ended up getting cancer. And for some reason, I struggled with visiting her in the hospital. But finally, something inside of me said, you need to go visit her in the hospital. And when I was working at the grocery store where Lydia and I worked, and so it was a Saturday, and I got off work about 4 o'clock and went straight to the hospital. And when I got in there, I was told it was too late, that she had just died. And so again, the if only disease struck me. If only I had gone to visit her more often, if only I had gone sooner, then maybe somehow my visitation would have made a difference and she would have lived longer. My sister, she was diagnosed very early in her life with type 1 diabetes. This is the one where you've got to have insulin all the time and monitor yourself. My sister tried to live a normal life, but this trying to live a normal life meant that she didn't always live the healthiest of life. She didn't always eat what she was supposed to eat, and she drank alcohol when she shouldn't have. She died at age 39 from illnesses that exacerbated her diabetes. She slipped into a coma and died. Again, that if only disease struck me. If she had taken better care of herself and her body, she would have lived longer, and she would have been a better person longer in life. By this time, her and her husband had adopted a son, and maybe she would have been a mother to her son longer. The next if only struck in that same year in June. And one evening, my brother decided that he and his 12-year-old daughter would drive the 12 miles from their little hometown into Shelbyville and rent a movie and get a pizza. There were two ways to go. There was kind of the side road that went parallel to the interstate, and there was the interstate itself. But since it was a nice, warm, sunny time, they decided to take the more country road. About halfway through the country, halfway to town, a driver was coming the other way and was blinded by the sun and turned into their car. My brother was very injured, and my 12-year-old niece was killed in the automobile accident. And so the if only disease strikes again, that if only he had taken the interstate, then Katie would still be alive. We hear in Ezekiel that he's the prophet to the Judeans and the Israelites in the Babylonian exile. God's people were being punished for not obeying the covenant that God had made with them and they had made with God. They had not loved God and they had not loved their neighbor. If only the Israelites and the Judeans had obeyed God's laws, they would not have been punished. They would not have been taken into exile. Then in our gospel we have the story of Lazarus, which has a lot of if only disease in it. Jesus is told that Lazarus is ill, and Jesus knows he's going to die. So he intentionally waits until Lazarus is dead. Then he goes to Bethany. He's greeted by Martha, who says, "If only you had been here, Lord, my brother would not have died." Then he's greeted by Mary, who says, "If only you had been here, Lord, my brother would not have died." If only. And then the crowds question Jesus. If he could give sight to the blind man, could he not have stopped Lazarus from dying? Call into question. If only Jesus really was the Son of God, the Messiah, maybe Lazarus would not have died. In my 17 years of ministry here at St. John's, I've watched many people die and buried many people. On Friday, I buried a 39-year-old man, a loving husband and a father. 39 is too young to die for him and for my sister. If only something could have been done to prevent this tragedy, this unneeded death. Our lives are filled with too many if-onlys. We all have them. We all suffer from this if-only disease. We have regret and remorse that somehow we could change the past. H.G. Wells wrote the book The Time Machine. And in it, the main character, he wants to get engaged and marry his fiancée. But unfortunately, she dies just as after he proposes. So he builds this time machine in the hope that he can go back and somehow prevent her from dying. If only he could change the course of events. But time after time he goes back and trying to prevent her death. And every time he fails. She only dies in a different way each and every time, and his efforts are futile. What can be done about this if-only disease? The answer is hope. The answer is a promise, the resurrection promise. God promised Ezekiel that Israel would be restored. Jesus promised that Lazarus would live again. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Jesus brought back several people from death and near death. But they all still died a bodily death. The death rate among humanity is 100%. We will all someday die. But the point is, we can't allow ourselves to get caught up in this disease of this thinking, if only. It's not the length of life that matters, but the quality of life that we live. The human body is frail and broken. Scientists have been able to map out our human genome, and they know all of our DNA strands, and they can see all of the flaws in our genetics. And maybe someday they'll be able to fix some of it, if not already. But it won't stop death. It doesn't stop the aging process. And then on top of that, accidents happen. Stuff happens. Put it in PG. We create laws and national safety measures to reduce risk. And we have OSHA, and we have all of these people that try to prevent accidents from happening, but they still do. Death still occurs. If you are living your life still clinging to this if-only disease, I urge you to let go. Give it to God. If-only disease is corrosive. And it's corrosive to the soul and the body and the mind and the spirit. And to really heal ourselves, we have to stop living into this if-only disease. Amen.